I'm assuming everyone can hear me. I think we'll start. David might catch up in a moment. Bear with me, I've not used the technology before, so if it's on at the wrong time and off at the right time, as they say. Read through the fire emergency first. There are no planned fire drills during this meeting. If you hear the alarm sound, please treat it as a real emergency and evacuate the building via the nearest safe escape route. Basically, don't run towards the fire. The nearest escape route is via the stairs to your left as you leave the council chamber, or for John, he should know where he's going. Exit via the door at the back of the building and walk across the inner car park to the evacuation point, which is the pavement opposite the police station. Do not use the lifts. Please do not re-enter the building until you're advised that it's safe to do so by a staff member. Is that clear? Marvellous. Going to say nobody's running towards it. Thank you all for attending. I'd just like to first of all put on record thanks to Councillor Churchman for previously chairing these meetings. I know she's not with us this evening, but I think it's important we acknowledge the work she's done. And I'd like to take this as an opportunity to remind us really of what Scrutiny is for. We're here to make a positive impact on services. We're not here to ask gotcha questions and try and catch people out. I hope you all agree with that. We're here to promote good practice and even seek it out where necessary. We will challenge underperformance, but not as a witch hunt, but as a critical friend that will help put it right, rather than just try and find the problem. Act as agent for change, which is very important, and we'll also deal with any partnership issues that come up. And that's not aimed at you, Steve, particularly. It's just a statement. But most importantly, have focus on outcomes, and even more importantly, I think, is to enjoy the meetings, because they can tend to go on, and it is at the end of the working day. That said, I'm going to set an ambitious time limit of 2 hours for these meetings, because I know they can go on longer. If we can beat that, even better. But I don't want to stifle debate at all. I think it's very important we get the chance to discuss what we need to. So if everyone's okay with that, I shall carry on. So first of all, to confirm the minutes as a true record of the meeting held on the 4th of March, is everyone happy for me to sign the minutes off? I've been told don't let anyone talk anyway, so I shall do that. And then Paul can have those. Initial each page, do I, Paul?
Yes.
Okay. There we go. You can have your pen back as well. Thank you, Paul. Any declarations of interest? No, Miles, I don't have to use the gavel. Fantastic. I don't believe any public questions, unless John's come as a member of the public. I don't think we've had any. So we're cracking on. Look at that for time saving. So it's straight into our lovely friends over in Hampshire, really, if you'd like to crack on, Steve.
Well, good evening, members. It's really nice to be here. And it would be even better if we were in slightly different circumstances and less socially distanced. This is actually one of my favourite committees, because I think we do really get into the workings of children's services, and you get a much deeper understanding of the work that we do. And what we have done over the years, but absolutely to your discretion, Chair and members, is we've tended to focus one session on, broadly speaking, children's social care, and the next session, broadly speaking, on education issues. But it doesn't quite, there's not always quite the timelines for each of them. So the next one, actually, we've got a complaints paper, which is a regular paper, but doesn't fit, it fits between the two. So very happy to take your steer on that as we go ahead. This evening, because it was on the forward plan, it's broadly social care, but there are some other issues in there that we were able to talk about. At the risk of getting off to a bad start with our new chair, I'm going to correct him on one thing, but it's something I do feel passionate about, which is that we are Isle of Wight officers. And it's really, really, but we're really proud to work for the Isle of Wight, and we're really pleased to be here. And we work across Isle of Wight and Hampshire, but what we do is I'm always the Director of Children's Services for Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. We work as one team across the piece, and we're always absolutely delighted, and really delighted to be here in person. It really feels like things are getting back to normal, being back in the council chamber. Anyway, without further ado, we've got the first paper on that from that introduction is around holiday activities and catch up and COVID catch up. And Suzanne is going to walk us through this. I'm really hoping the technology is going to work, but I'm assured that it will. So, Suzanne, do you want to introduce yourself and walk us through it?
Yep. Hi, can I just check everybody can hear me? Oh, I can hear myself, which is quite unnerving. I'm Suzanne Smith. I'm the Assistant Director for Access Resources and Business Development for both Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. And yeah, there are what I wanted to, the paper that you've got in front of you this evening is around the holiday activities and food scheme. Is that where you want me to start, Steve, or do you want me to start on winter grants?
Entirely up to you, Suzanne.
Okay,
where does your presentation start?
I can see that the slides are on the winter grants, so perhaps if I start there. So the presentation that you've got in front of you was really to site members on the impact of the COVID winter grants. This was money that was given to the Isle of Wight Council by the Department for Work and Pensions from the period December 2020 through to May 2021. They have subsequently provided some additional grant funding, but because of what we've achieved collectively, working closely with Kathy and colleagues across the community and voluntary sector in the island, with schools, with early years settings, I really wanted members to be cited on the support that was provided to citizens. So just want to run you through the presentation quite quickly. What I can't see necessarily what you can see, but I'm hoping we can move to slide 2, which is the context and summary. So just to set out that the grant from DWP came with some conditions, and those conditions were that at least 80% of the funding had to be used to provide food and fuel support to vulnerable households with children, and no more than 20% of the funding could be used for other types of household. And the second criteria was that at least 80% of the funding had to be used on food and fuel support, and that was direct financial support, and no more than 20% could be used on other items. So we had to issue out funding within those broad criteria. Across the Isle of Wight, we took a broad definition of how we would define or how we would identify vulnerable households with children. And at the bottom of the slide, you'll see that we looked at all children who were eligible for benefits related to free school meals, but also those children who had a social worker, those open to early help services, older young people who were previously eligible to free school meals, and also children in the early years settings who were eligible for early years pupil premium. And that meant that we were able to support thousands of young people and families across Hampshire. And on the right of the slide, you'll be able to see some key facts and figures around the amount of children that were supported through the meal vouchers, the number of vulnerable households that we supported. And just very quickly, I just wanted to step you through some of those key achievements. So if we could move on to slide 4, I'd just like to outline the work that we did with education settings. So we provided funding to schools, colleges and early years settings to support benefits eligible free school meal children with meal vouchers during the school holidays between December and May. Over 11,000 vouchers were issued across that period. Further, or in addition to that, we also provided discretionary funding so that schools and early years settings could help families who might not necessarily meet benefits criteria, who might recently have been made redundant, for example, or be having particular hardship because of the pandemic. And we gave schools this funding so that they could support those families at their discretion. And then in addition to that, we supported in another 11 schools with something a little bit more sustainable, and that was to provide the equipment and funding to support to put in place edible kitchens and support young people with both learning about kind of growing and producing food as well as the kind of food provision itself. And there's further benefit to 800 children there. Moving on, we also provided support to care leavers and young carers. So young carers through a grant to the Young Carers Project run by YMCA. I think you might be hearing more about that later today. And also vouchers directly to care leavers for both food and fuel. We worked with the community and voluntary sector. We had some grant funding that could be accessed and bid into, and we provided 31 grants to a total of 23 providers, and that was for a range of different types of projects, from cookery programs through to direct provision of food parcels to families who needed that level of support. And over 10,000 families and individuals benefited through those grants that we awarded. In addition to that, we provided a grant to Citizens Advice Bureau, and that was specifically targeted at fuel support. And we felt that Citizens Advice were well placed to work with families not only around that direct financial support, but also with the wider advice and guidance that families might need when they are in debt and struggling to pay utility bills. And we've got a kind of metric on there that Citizens Advice were able to work with families to resolve and clear nearly £97,000 worth of debt through debt relief orders and other mechanisms during the period of the grant. We did extensive communications over the period of the winter grant, and again, I've just summarised on here that we had over 45,000 hits on Facebook, posts that we put up about the different provision that was in place. We used all the different media that were available to us, and we also set up, working with Citizens Advice, a directory of support so that all the things that we were funding could be identified through the I'll Find It website and directory, so that we've got, people could access things more easily if they weren't picking up our media and comms. And then just finally, I've included some of the feedback, and for me, this is one of the most kind of motivating things about working on this, is that you really could see the direct impact that we were having with the funding that we've given out. We had feedback around, a really transformational effect on families, particularly around Christmas, when they didn't know this money was coming, and then it arrived and had a really huge impact on those families. So I'm conscious that I've flown through that, but I was really keen to share with members what we achieved in a relatively short period. Happy to take any questions on that if you have any.
Thank you, Suzanne. Any questions for Suzanne? Rodney.
Just a comment, Chairman, a positive comment, with regard to the edible kitchens and the cookery instructions. I'm a big believer in cooking, making people learn how to cook for themselves, and that helps them with their own resilience and being able to look after themselves. I don't know if in the education system that they still do domestic science, but I think it's important that people should be able to look after themselves like that. And also home economics, so that they can budget and all those sorts of things. I think that's practical, and that should be enhanced. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Ronnie. I don't know the answer to that. Is cookery still taught in school, basically? Yes. It's not food. It's not the food science thing, like drawing a pizza stuff still, though, is it? They do actually.
It's generally it comes under various guises. When my daughter did it, I didn't know what she was talking about. Then it's cooking. But it is taught. But it tends to fade out after the children started their GCSE program. So it's really years 7 and 8 that they focus on home economics or design and technology, I think is one acronym for it, but it's in there.
I've got a couple of questions, Suzanne. You might be surprised to hear. This is great stuff, really good stuff. But with anything, what needs to be done better for next time, for the summer and beyond?
So at the moment, we've got funding. They've renamed it. It was the COVID Winter Grant Scheme. We've got the COVID Local Support Grant at the moment, which has the same criteria, but only runs to the 20th of June. So at we've had to allocate that quite quickly. We're unsure at the moment as to whether or not there'll be money over the summer. But one of the challenges with this particular pot of funding has been the short notice with which we've been given to allocate it out. And what that really means is that if you had more time, you could think really strategically about how you could use the funding to develop really sustainable support that goes beyond an immediate kind of fix, if you like, through the issue of free school meal vouchers. So if there were to be ongoing funding, I think the thing that we would benefit most from would be more notice with which to really think about how to have the best impact long term.
Is there anything we can do to help with that, or is that just central government?
My suspicion is that this will be a time limited programme. I think perhaps we'll get some additional funding for summer because of what's happened just recently with the recovery dates being put back, but I suspect that there may not be any funding after that. I think it then kind of segues nicely into the holiday activity and food scheme, which is also a temporary pot of funding, but I think what would be useful would be to push for longer term funding around that programme, because it's targeting the same type of vulnerable children, and again with more notice and upfront kind of commitment to a longer term funding window, we could think really creatively about how to use that.
Thank you. And the thing you mentioned in the written report was difficulty finding HAF providers. Was there any particular barriers? I noticed as well they ended up with an excess of places, and you did some good work selling the places, which seemed like a clever move to me. But is there a particular problem attracting providers?
So I've got two papers here. So the holiday activities and food one is kind of linked to the winter grants that I've just spoken about. I can pick that question up. We had some issues around the timeliness of the funding, which would have led to some issues. And we've also got some providers who are still kind of working through their recovery and their kind of willingness to provide these kinds of programmes during the pandemic.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions for Suzanne? Excellent. Brilliant on timing as well. I'm very impressed. Thank you.
Okay, Chair, can I just check that you've clocked, to use the technical term, the holiday activity and fund paper, which is the next. Yeah. So, and Suzanne, I think, can walk you through that if you wish. I don't think you've got a presentation for this one, Suzanne. Am I correct?
No, it's just the paper.
Right. Okay.
Are you happy for me to move on to that now?
Indeed.
Okay. So the paper that was issued with your pack for this meeting talked about the holiday and food activities and food scheme. So this is Department for Education funding this time round for the period covering the Easter, summer and Christmas holidays this calendar year. So we've had one round of activities which we delivered over Easter, and in your report starting at paragraph 6, you've got a summary of what we delivered over Easter and how the attendance worked. The Easter scheme had to be mobilised very, very rapidly, and it was a particularly difficult time for some providers around the pandemic because some services were up and running and others weren't. And we did have some nervousness from providers around face-to-face delivery. Having said that, we did offer places to over 350 children on the island, and attendance was relatively good. And when we look at a number of other local authorities, they didn't provide any face-to-face support during that period. So I think it's a really fantastic achievement for those involved in this programme, the providers, the families, everybody for actually attending and getting value out of what was delivered. The paper then goes on to talk about what we're now planning for summer, and we've just concluded, and in fact it's been signed off today by the lead member for Children's Services, the grants for summer. We did have a better number of applications over the summer, and in the paper we talk about the different types of provision that we wanted to put in place, because this scheme covers all school-aged children, and as you'll appreciate, there are what might appeal to a 6 or 7-year-old might not be quite the same as the activities that will appeal to a teenager. So we were keen to encourage a real range of applications from the sector. In Appendix 1 of the paper, you've got a full list of the providers that we have recommended grant awards to, and we will now be starting a programme of training and induction with those providers. So during the grant application process, we worked with them to identify where they felt they had training needs, and we'll be doing work with them around safeguarding, but also around how they can provide emotional emotional health and wellbeing support to children, as well as working with partner agencies to ensure that as these children attend these activities and eat their meal and all those good things, we're also helping to signpost them to other agencies that might be able to support those families. We are looking to try and target around 30% uptake of the free school meal eligible cohort, and we've got sufficient places in the 1,268 places that we've commissioned to accommodate that. We have got further money coming in at Christmas, and so we are looking in the autumn as to how we reopen the grant round and put in place something for Christmas. Now, obviously, with the Isle of Wight school year, the Christmas holiday is very short, and one of the conversations I'm actively having with the Department for Education is how it might be beneficial for the island to actually be able to use some of that funding across the 2-week October half term. I haven't got agreement to that at this point in time, but I thought it might be helpful for me to outline that that's a conversation that we're trying to have with the Department for Education at this time. Appendix B to the paper gives some really good case studies around what we've achieved just with the Easter scheme, but we're really hoping to go much further than that with the summer scheme, particularly with that wider partner offer around, kind of really helping those children to be school ready in September, and also seeing what we can do around emotional resilience for those families who've struggled as a result of the pandemic. Happy to take any questions on that paper.
Thank you, Suzanne. I got a bit ahead of myself, sorry. Any questions for Suzanne? Stephen.
Hi, Suzanne. In paragraph 14, we say there was insufficient provision at Easter in Ventnor, East Cowes and West Whites. Do you think we're going to have sufficient provision in those areas this time?
Yes, we believe we will. We used the Easter scheme as almost a pilot in some respects to identify where, help us to identify where our gaps would be. And then we did some proactive work in advance of the summer grant round to make sure we had sufficient provision. We also mapped where all the free school meal eligible children were and the kind of coverage of the providers, so we could really encourage grant applications in areas where we thought we might have gaps.
Any others? No? Thank you, Suzanne.
Okay, so the next item on the agenda is a performance and budget update. And I think a combination of Stuart and Kathy are going to walk us through this. Is that correct, Stuart?
It is, Steve. Yes, thank you. Good evening, members, Chairman. I'm Stuart Ashley. I'm the Deputy Director for Children's Services, and I'm responsible for the Children and Families branch. Kathy and I are going to double handle this. Kathy's going to do the first bit, and then I will take you through some more detailed performance data. We'll do it quickly at pace because you've got the report that accompanies it. What I would say right at the outset is it's quite technical in terms of children's social care and performance, and I'm very happy to offer members a separate briefing if that would be of assistance, just to get a better understanding of the way that we work in children's social care. So I'll leave that on the table for members if they're interested in that, and I'm briefing the lead member hopefully later next week on exactly that subject. So that's an offer that's available. So Kathy, can I hand over to you, please?
Hopefully that's working. So yes, I'm just going to start. Good evening, I'm Kathy Marriott, the head of strategy and operations for the Children and Families branch here on the island. And I'm just going to give a quick overview of the local context, which I know some members who attended a recent briefing may be familiar with, before we get into our performance data. So just to give an overview in terms of the local context, so we have approximately 27,000 children and young people 0 to 19 on the island, and that represents about 19% of the whole island's population. As people may know, we obviously have a population that's more heavily weighted to our elderly community, but we're always keen to stress that childhood is for life, and this area needs, investment and attention, because actually it's about getting in early with our children and supporting them to have really positive outcomes. About 20% of the island's children are living in poverty, and one of the things I always stress around this is that actually most of those children come from families where a member of the family is working, and I think it's important to stress that. Our proportion of children entitled to free school meals, and we've just been talking about that, is around 18%, and that's in line with the national average, but we're out of kilter a little bit with the South East average. We are above that. And in terms of children with social, emotional and mental health needs, our public health data is saying that that's 3.2%. I think we know that over the last year we've seen a significant increase in terms of social, emotional and mental health issues in terms of our children and young people. The next slide just provides a bit of local context in terms of some of the social care data. My computer's just got stuck as well. Just mentioning the child poverty. We've put the referrals data up there, and the SN stands for statistical neighbours. South East is SE, and England average there as well. One of the things I would say is that lots of local authorities count referral data in different ways. So though we know that we have quite a high level of contacts and referrals, actually partly that's because we encourage it, because we want people, if they have concerns about safeguarding, to be in touch with our MASH team. But it's also about the way that we count that locally that is a divergence from perhaps other local authorities as well. You'll see there that we have a higher level of Section 47 inquiries than perhaps other local authorities. Section 47 are child protection investigations. We are conscious that we need to absolutely undertake those child protection investigations. We carry those out in a really timely way, and it's important that if people do have safeguarding concerns, they are appropriately referred through. And we know that our thresholds in MASH are entirely appropriate. They've been tested out a number of times. We're going to go more into the data in terms of our children in need figures, child protection and our looked after children, as well as our care leavers. So I shall leave that slide there. And if we move on to the next one. This just talks a bit to our service plan that sits underneath the corporate priorities. And I'm just flagging it for new members really about kind of like the raison d'etre really of our service is about supporting families at an early stage to look after their children and to try and prevent problems from escalating into statutory services. It's about leading the work across a partnership of agencies, so that includes our health colleagues, our education colleagues, and also police, as well as the voluntary and community sector, but we lead the work around keeping children safe and protecting them from harm, abuse and neglect. And when children cannot stay safely at home, it is about providing them with some permanence and some high quality care arrangements, whether that is foster care or through residential provision, or indeed with a connected carer. Okay, so moving on. So over to Stuart.
Okay, thank you, Kathy. So what you can see on the screen now is referral data. So what we count as a referral, we get a number of contacts, but if they're going to progress and be considered by a social worker as to whether it warrants a social work assessment, then it's counted as a referral. And what you can see is what Kathy described earlier, statistical neighbours, the South East and England, and the Isle of Wight is significantly higher than that. It's come down and then it's gradually gone back up. I'm very comfortable with that, and I think members should be. Yes, there's the counting issue. All local authorities count referrals slightly differently, but we encourage schools in particular to over-refer. If you're concerned about a child, then it's okay to contact a social worker in the multi-agency safeguarding hub and test that out. I'd much rather professionals over-referred than under-referred. That way, we catch more children who might be at risk. Next slide, please. And then what you have here is contacts. That contact is a phone call, an email. Most of those contacts will be signposted elsewhere. If someone phones up the multi-agency safeguarding hub with a query about Mental health support, we might say you need to speak to your GP. It's not a social work issue at this stage. And what you can see with the blue bars is the number of contacts, and the pattern actually follows what's happened during the pandemic. At the beginning of the pandemic, the number of contacts and referrals into children's services declined because of the national lockdowns. Children weren't in school. They then gradually picked up, actually picked up within 2 to 3 months, and then have gone back to normal levels. The red line is referrals. So those contacts where we've said, actually, there's something more here that we need to look at as social workers. And what you can see there is stark, in my view. At the beginning of lockdown, referrals reduced, and then you can see we've had a spike in demand. And that's really been fairly well sustained at around about 15% over and above normal for what we would deal with. And interestingly as well, what I can tell members is that the complexity of the work coming into children's services has increased significantly. Experienced social workers are telling us that actually what we're dealing with as a result of the pandemic is simply more complex. Next slide, please. So something around our timeliness. So we have to complete assessments within 45 working days. We often will aim to complete them a lot quicker than that if we need to. And as you can see there, the performance is consistently good and above the South East average. And then if a case needs to go to an initial child protection conference following a child protection investigation, it needs to happen within 15 working days. And I think that's an important measure. If it warrants going to a multi-agency conference to protect a child, then we should do it in a timely way. And generally, that's been very good. You'll see in Q4 it wasn't so good. There were some challenges there from all agencies. That is the impact of the pandemic. Doesn't mean that children weren't safe, because we have a contingency, which is if we can't set the conference up in the required timescales, for example, if social workers are unavailable because they're unwell, in the meantime, we'll visit the child every 5 working days, which is more than we would visit them if they became subject to a child protection plan. So there's a fail-safe there to make sure that children are protected. The 70% has increased already since Q4, and I'm comfortable. We have to accept that performance is sometimes, with particularly difficult circumstances, will dip. The issue and the reassurance for members is A, there's a contingency there to keep children safe, and B, we understand why it happened. And basically it was the pandemic. And then this is a number of children subject to a child protection plan. And what you can see there is that has been rising ever since the beginning of the pandemic. Interestingly enough, the numbers have been coming down for the last 18 months on the island because of the good work of social workers working, getting in earlier, delivering particular interventions, and so protecting children. But of course, with the pandemic and services closing down, actually many more families have gone into crisis. And so we have had to deal with, as I said, more complex work. So more children have been subject to child protection planning. Longer term, I anticipate that will come down as well. Next slide, please. This is the number of children in need. Children in need is a term defined by the Children Act. It's basically where children have unmet needs, and so following a social work assessment, and the social workers coordinate response to that unmet need. You'll see there that the rate on the island is higher than it is in the South East and with statistical neighbours, and nationally. My answer to that as to why it is actually not straightforward. Firstly, you have the previous failure of children's services back in 2012-13. That actually meant that there are a cohort of children, a large cohort of children, who for a number of years had never received the service they needed. Some of those adolescents are now having children themselves, and we are now dealing with their children. So it echoes a failure such as was experienced, echoes over a number of years. It's the same with our looked after children numbers. You will see that they are high. That's for exactly the same reason. There's a legacy issue that works its way through the system, and it can take 10, 15 years to do so. There's also the element of deprivation that Kathy referred to earlier as well. Play and being coastal, we know, don't we, that coastal communities, there's greater deprivation, issues around unemployment. Put those ingredients in the pot, and that's what the narrative is there. Again, we're confident that that's the reason. We look at it, we analyse it, we We talk to colleagues from other local authorities, and I think that's a fair assessment of where we are. Next slide, please. And I've just said this, our numbers have looked after children in the care of the Isle of Wight Council. There's a bulge in the system. If we took children into care in 2014, when the partnership started with Hampshire, and they were 2, 3, 4, 5 years old, they're going to be with us until they're 18. And in fact, our duties extend until they're 25. So it will take a long time for those children to move through the system. At the same time, you have other children coming into the system because perhaps their parents didn't get the service they needed some time ago. Next slide, please. I actually can't read that from here, so I'm sure it's. Can you see it, Kathy?
Yeah, I mean, it's very similar, really. It just shows kind of up to date. So at the end of Q4, we had 272 children in care. So it was just bringing that picture up to date. So that's all really.
Fine. Thank you.
I'll just add to that. That's quite an interesting slide because that shows that although generally over the years the rate has been increased, it's plateaued, and that's sort of what we're hoping and expect it's to do with some of the changes in social work practice that we've put in place. More will look later, but that's a more granular rate than previous growth.
And then there's the age profile of our collective looked after children. There's nothing particularly unusual about that. You would see that in most local authorities, but you'll see there is a bulge with the older cohort of children, reflecting some of my previous comments. And then caseloads, an important measure by the regulator, Ofsted, an important measure for our workforce as well. Social workers need the time and capacity to deliver meaningful interventions. They can only do that if they have manageable caseloads. And you can see there that despite the increase in work that's coming into children's services, despite the extra complexity, caseloads have been relatively stable and in fact have dipped just a little bit of late. We think that's absolutely the right place for caseloads to be. Around 2021 is a good measure. And our social workers tell us that. They have a number of other supports as well that at some point we'll get into.
Just worth explaining to Stuart that that's the average number of children, and of course there can be 3, 4, 5 children in the families who we work with, so it's actually quite fewer families. Usually works out on average about half 100 families that we work with. So the social workers might work with 10 families and 20 children. And that when you explain about it all, it still feels a bit more natural.
And when I ask social workers, they say, I've got a big caseload. They say, well, what is it? They say, it's 25. And I say, well, why is that? Always someone has a family of 7 or 8 every single time. And, you know, that's the reality of what they're working with. So, and those things will go up and down. It's what we work with. And then something around the workforce. Our vacancy rate is really positive on the island. It's less than the English average. Our turnover rate and our use of agency workers. Agency workers are now part of all local authority workforces in children's social care. The world has changed. We have many staff that like to work for 6, 7 months and then travel. So they become agency social workers. We have a memorandum of cooperation across the southeast that's being reviewed to try and manage the price of agency workers because they're more expensive. But we do want them as part of our workforce. But as you can see there, there's not an over-reliance, and that's a positive picture. Next slide, please. And there's just something around quality assurance. You know, how do I know, how does the director know about the quality of social work practice? We have a really robust quality assurance framework that Ofsted have gone through in great detail and said is a strong quality assurance framework. You can see there 188 cases audited in 2020, and some of the feedback, the analysis of that. And I audit some of the audits. So I will look at cases that managers have audited with my senior managers. So Kathy and I will look at cases to say, is the benchmark right? Is the quality of practice really what we're hearing? And I have to say, in about nine times out of 10, I would agree with the audits. There'll always be room for improvement and discussion. We're not perfect, though. And you can see, if you look at the bottom, 70% evidence that ethnicity and culture was considered. So we draw out themes from our quality assurance audits so that we can continuously improve practice. And there's also a range of multi-agency audits at the bottom there. Next slide, please. And I'll hand back to Kathy. Yeah, thank you.
So we alluded earlier to some quite exciting work that's happening across the Children and Families branch and with our partner agencies as well. And we've had some investment as a department into a range of transformation programmes. So the first one to highlight to you is the Hampshire and Isle of Wight approach. This is about kind of changing our methodology, the way that we work with children and families. It's about coming from a strength-based rather than a deficit model. It's about absolutely recognising risk, but working with the entire family holistically to empower them and to support resilience. So we have, despite the pandemic, delivered training across all of our staff in this approach and particular interventions and techniques that they can use with families. And we are already seeing quite a significant impact of that way of working, and that's also influencing the way our partners are working as well, to being much more trauma informed and strength based. We have developed a multidisciplinary team. It's called RAFT. We live by the sea, so we like to use these names. So it's the Resilience Around Families team. It's a multidisciplinary team, and in that team we have adult mental health workers, adult substance misuse workers, child mental health practitioners, as well as intensive family support workers. And they're delivering really targeted support and interventions. The real key aim around that is working with priority cohorts of families to enable children to stay at home safely. They also work with families where we can see that there is a hope for reunification, so children who are looked after, but actually with some support we can work with the family so that those children can go back and live safely at home. And that team, we've been monitoring their work over the last year and are having about an 85 to 90% success rate, and that's not just whilst they're undertaking the work. We're going back and revisiting those families 6 months and a year later to see that the impact of that work is sustained. Rather more mundane, but really critically important to the work that we deliver is a new case management system that we've invested in alongside Hampshire. That will be coming in over the next year. The aim is actually to have a much more fit for purpose system. Our current system is not 21st century. We all use it and love it, but actually we can look to do things better. And what we're hoping to do through that new management system is maximise the time that our social workers can actually be out working with families and supporting children. So it's about reducing bureaucracy and having a really fit for purpose system. Another exciting programme that we're working on, again alongside our partners in Hampshire, is the Modernising Placements programme, and that's very much about making sure that we have the right choice of provision for our looked after children. We deliver the right quality of care, the best quality of care, and we manage the cost and stability of placements. A really big part of that is about doing our best to recruit more in-house foster carers on the island and really improving the support and the training that we provide to them, and also creating what's called a hive model where foster carers can support each other and provide each other with short breaks. So it's about really creating much more resilience in that system, and that's a piece of work that we'll be doing over the next 3 years. And then finally, we are working again with our Hampshire colleagues about improving the access to performance and quality data, creating much more intelligent ways of monitoring our data, reducing the reliance on kind of having to manually pull data together, creating management dashboards, etc. And again, that's about efficiency so that we can maximise the work with our children and families and more effectively target that. Okay, so next slide. As Stuart said earlier, we are absolutely not resting on our laurels. We recognise where we've got areas for continued improvement. Yes, we got to good in 2018, but we're really ambitious that we want to get to outstanding in the future. So the areas that we've self-identified are further embedding that Hampshire and Isle of Wight approach that I was talking about, making sure that the plans that we undertake with family, whether that's an early help plan, a child in need plan or a child protection plan, are co-produced with families, that they're smart, they're easy to understand, and that we actually deliver the outcomes for our children and families. As I've spoke about earlier, our big ambition is absolutely to support children to be able to live safely at home where we possibly can, and where children do become looked after, make sure that reunification is a consideration and that we work towards those plans. We want to ensure that, building on the work that's happened during the pandemic, we really enhance and further enhance our partnership working with schools. And in fact, I was at a head teachers meeting this morning doing just that. And we're really looking to promote attendance and attainment for the most vulnerable children. One of the areas that we've self-identified is making sure that our staff are getting supported in the best way possible, and that's one of the key things around that, is making sure that they have the supervision, that's their meetings with their line managers, to be able to reflect on their cases, to talk about the work that they've undertaken, and to look at what work needs to happen in the future, and making sure that's as high quality as possible. Further increase the number of in-house foster carers, as I've said, and a real key part for us is about, for our looked after children, really building those pathways to independence, into successful adulthood for those young people. So we've developed a housing scheme around those young people, and we're looking to develop further some deposit schemes for them in the future, because that's what young people are saying they really want from us. I'll go quite quickly through these slides because we have kind of talked about them in other meetings. Our approach through COVID, we have carried on doing business as usual, but doing it differently. We were obviously all quite hopeful that we might be able to return to a phased reopening of some of our offices next week, and those plans have been put on ice. But just to provide assurance that throughout the pandemic, we undertook risk assessments in terms of every case, looking at where we needed to do face-to-face visits and where we would manage virtual visiting. That's continued, and actually we've gradually much increased our face-to-face visiting back to kind of pre-pandemic levels, doing that safely and making sure that our staff are supported. Fortunately, we never had to move to phase 2 and 3, but we did have plans and contingency plans about how we would manage things if we had, for instance, a 50% reduction in staff, where we might need to place our staff in the really business critical areas of the service. Just moving on, as I say, we've worked really well in partnership with schools, and again we looked at every child in our caseload, every child being able to access school. We undertook risk assessments where children weren't accessing schools, and worked with our schools and colleges to enable children to take up the offer of those places and get our children back into schools where we could. We've also ensured that children have been enabled to get laptops, so many of the families we work with didn't have the technology originally to be able to access some of that school provision, so we've made sure that's in place, and we continue to have that really good strength-based partnership working with our schools. We've continued to meet with partner agencies. In fact, we met yesterday as a Safeguarding Children's Partnership. We're meeting once a month just to kind of keep in touch with each other about how we're responding to the COVID pandemic, any areas where we've got areas of high risk. We've shared data. Stuart has met almost daily, I think, with the head of public protection for Hampshire Police. And we've worked really closely with our health colleagues as well, where there's been cases of young people who have high levels of needs, particularly in terms of their emotional well-being. And what next? The next slide, we do now have a plan in terms of an incremental move back to the building, but what we actually want to make sure is that we capitalise on the gains that have been made through working in a really different way. So we're not going to move back to all of our staff being back in the office. Actually, we want our staff to be visible, to be out there working with families, maximising the time that they can spend. We've made sure that our staff have had access to the vaccinations, that they've had PPE when they've been undertaking visits, etc., and we will maintain our well-being and our duty of care to our staff through that, as well as our foster carers as well. We've really supported them through the pandemic. Over to Stuart.
Just a brief update, as we provided previously on the financial position. We've had additional support from the council in terms of additional staffing as a response to extra demand. That's been funded in the main through COVID grants. we have worked hard to reduce the costs around children looked after, but members, I have to say, it remains a pressure. The average cost of a child in care is £60,000. You saw the numbers that we have for the island. So that will always be a pressure. That's part of our modernising placements programme as well. But we have sought to maximise the availability of COVID grants to offset those pressures. And as I said, we've had the support corporately to do that. Next slide, please. So just in conclusion, there's a lot in that presentation. My very brief summary will be performance is actually relatively strong, stronger than many local authorities that we compare ourselves with, despite demand levels and levels of need being higher than many of those authorities, our statistical neighbours and other local authorities in the South East. We do have a rigorous quality assurance framework. We test ourselves. We're absolutely transparent with that. It's absolutely pointless to my mind in having a quality assurance process that doesn't expose our weaknesses and areas for development. And that's part of how we continuously improve. And I'll be quiet there. Thank you, Chairman, members.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Cathy. Any questions? John.
I think that's it. It was just a comment, really. I think it's a really impressive amount of information you've given us. It's really positive to see, considering that, how extraordinarily difficult it must have been in the last couple of years. It is now 2 years, isn't it, with the pandemic. I just want to emphasise. I think one of the main concerns that we have is if we don't have sufficient resources on the island. Of course, that's always our problem, being a small authority, therefore not sufficient foster carers or specialised accommodation. There's always that extra trauma, emotional trauma of being separated from the island itself. We really want to try, if we possibly can, to keep children on the island. And I do appreciate this is very difficult to have the resources all the time necessary for that. But it's, I think, in terms of the emotional effect, because it is, as you know, that piece of water does make a difference. And I think for a child, it's particularly important if they're separated from home, friends, school, etc. It must be quite traumatic to be unable to stay on the island.
I think that's a really well-made point, Councillor. When we were inspected by Ofsted in 2018, one of the issues they raised with us is accommodation around care leavers. The councils listened to that, because actually we were placing young people off the island at 18 and 19 because they had quite high needs, but we didn't have the right resources on the island. Councils responded, I have to say, remarkably to that, and we do now have a range of resources around that. There will never be full sufficiency for the island. Interestingly enough, and if I put my Hampshire hat on for a second, there's not sufficiency in Hampshire either. I'm placing Hampshire children outside of Hampshire. Sometimes that's just because of demand levels. Sometimes it's because of really specialist need. If you have a child with very, very complex disabilities, actually they might need a very particular resource. There might only be 2 or 3 of them in the country. But it's a well-made point, because we respect children's right to live within their community. When I first came to the island, there was an issue with children who were being placed for adoption were being placed off the island. And that's a policy, and Rachel may well at some point touch on that when she talks to her report. That was a policy that we changed because we didn't think, sometimes it's necessary, but it's not always necessary. You have to do it on a sort of need-by-need basis, if I can use that phrase. It's something we are very conscious of.
Can I just to add to what Stuart said, tucked away in the presentation also was a little bit of detail around our transformation programme. And one of the things that we want to do in that is look really closely at our placements capability and what is it that attracts people to being a foster carer. And it's not just money, because part of it is altruistic. But we also know that some of it is about the support that they get and 24/7 support. So that's part of our transformation programme. We've done a lot of research now about what attracts people in. We've actually learned some really interesting and useful lessons from adoption, which is a slightly different thing. You're going to hear about that later, about how they can better make better use of that first contact with the person who's interested and get them through the door. And we've also got to think about how we use our resources, how we support children in those placements in a slightly different way. And that's our transformation plan. But if we can get that right, we will increase our capacity here and in Hampshire because those foster carers will feel more supported. That's the plan, anyway.
Any further questions? Rodney?
Thank you, Chairman. Stuart, I don't know if I heard correctly or if I'm going to get this wrong, but when you spoke about the mental health cases and referring to GPs, is that correct? That they contact their GP. Is that right?
It's not a blanket response. I was giving a sort of broad brush example. If we get a referral and it's around a child with mental health issues, we would want to assess that ourselves with health. But sometimes we do get, for example, this is a genuine example that I've heard myself in the MASH. We get people phoning up saying, how do I access a school uniform? We can give them information as to how you can access that. You don't need a social work assessment for a school uniform. So we signpost out wherever we can. And sometimes people phone up and say, I need some advice around diet for my child. Fine, that's a GP referral in my opinion. That's not something for a social worker.
One thing that I was pleased to note in the transformation, the reduction of bureaucracy. That's very good.
Thank you, Councillor Downer. Any other questions? Just a couple from me. I've noticed the cost savings look great. Are they because of COVID rather than something that you expected to happen? And moving forward, when we're out of this, will the cost savings be the same? And I guess what I'm trying to say is a pressure being put on you to save money that's affecting you getting to excellent?
My response to that is we have always delivered savings as required as a part of Children's Services contribution to the Council's overall savings target. Where we have started to go in a slightly different direction is using transformation to reduce future costs to the Council. So if we have less children coming into care, more children staying safely at home, where it's appropriate for them to do so, that's potentially a big saving for the Council in the long term. And that's been the approach that we've taken. That's not to say we can't make other savings around the edges, but in terms of large savings, the main costs of my budget are looked after children costs.
Just to add to that, it's a complicated old thing, but in the broadest sense, that you'll see that there's pressures in future years, but those pressures relate to exactly this thing, which is the anticipated increasing number of children looked after, which is why that slide that I brought to your attention was quite so important, because it didn't show an increase, it showed a levelling off. Now, if you have a levelling off against a projected pressure, you're effectively making the saving. And that's what we anticipate to be the Children's Services contribution in the next few years. And that will be done through the transformation programme.
But I mean, thank you for the report. It's excellent, and there's some excellent work going on. What would you say would be the two things that failing is the wrong word, but you really want to be able to attack and improve on? Because there's lots of good stuff, but there's always something in an organisation that you think, if only I had the resources to do, what would those two things be?
I think we've got them in train, which is the Hampshire and Isle of Wight approach. Hampshire is probably, I wouldn't say a year ahead, probably 6-7 months ahead with the impact of that transformation work, and it's been remarkable actually, and I'm really pleased that we've had the corporate support in conjunction with the expertise around us to deliver it. And I'm confident that's going to be exactly the same for the island. And I think the other one, particularly for the island, is our modernising placements programme. We haven't got, we've got Bewley House as a children's home. I can't see that it's cost effective for the Isle of Wight Council to build its own children's homes, but actually in conjunction with Hampshire, having a specialist resource to access for a short period of time for a child in crisis, that might be a really good outcome. And that's part of the relationship between the two local authorities over that programme. So I think those are the two, because that's a wicked issue. That's a wicked issue nationally, placements. There's a national shortage of them. And I think that our work, and it's early days at the moment, but that will have a really big impact.
I also think corporately the support around our foster carers So Isle of Wight Council foster carers, I think that is something that as a whole council we can really get behind, and I think there are initiatives and ideas that we have around that I think as part of that modernising placement programme, because we're a unitary, I think there's some ideas that we've got that we can push forward on as well with that.
Thank you. Any other questions, or should we move on? Yeah.
Just a couple of things I want to add. One is it's an offer, really. One is if any members here who haven't visited the multi-agency safeguarding hub, really recommend it, because it gives you a different perspective. You hear the phone calls coming in, etc. It's just real time, well worth doing. There's an offer that's open. Go through Kathy or Stuart, and we'll set that up for you. The second thing is, members may have seen, if you read the newspapers or look on the websites today, and on Today programme, there was stuff around the National Review of Children's Social Care led by Josh McAllister. It's an interesting review. It's many of the things that Stuart has outlined as our transformation programme are the things that are recommended in the next stage of the review. So it's really positive for us. He's making out a case for change, and I personally think he may have overstated the case of change, because it's a bit, everything's terrible, but it's not. Everything's not terrible. He wants to get into the Treasury. And that's my final point, is that the Spending Review 21 will be critical. I think it inconceivable, going back to the money, I think it inconceivable that there will not be more money coming into children's social care off the back of that review, because the deficit nationally is running into billions of pounds in terms of the shortages. So those things link together.
Thank you. So should we move on to what we've got next? Young Carers Support Report.
He's going to walk us through this one.
Yes, this is a relatively short paper and was requested by Councillor Churchman previously. We recognising kind of the impact of the COVID pandemic, particularly around young carers who are, of course, a vulnerable group. So it just outlines really the work that a commission provider, the YMCA, have been delivering to young carers across the island. So I'll just run through the highlights, and then obviously I'm open to any questions at all. So the Isle of Wight Council, through the Children and Families branch, commissions a support service for young carers through the YMCA, and the YMCA are currently supporting approximately 300 young carers across the Isle of Wight. Those young carers are made up of young people who are supporting either their parents or potentially a sibling at home. The programme of support includes one-to-one support, and that's for those who have higher levels of need, and that supports those young carers at home or at school. It's also about providing social opportunities to meet as a peer group in a safe space, although obviously over the last year that's been far more challenging, but they have had virtual meetings together, and when possible have had socially distanced ones in the fresh air. They have advisory staff who are there to support and listen to children and young people, and there's kind of a helpline that those young carers can ring into and have some discussions, and also information and guidance and support to carers and their families. They provide those activities which act as a bit of a respite, a short break for those young carers, and in normal times that includes a residential weekend at a young carers festival over at Fairthorne Manor every summer, and I've been to a couple of those. They're absolutely amazing events. Due to the pandemic, obviously some of their support's been restricted, as I say, but one of the things that has been great this year is that through the winter grant scheme that we were talking about earlier, we've been able to support our young carers and their families. We provided grants totalling £8,400 to the YMCA to support young carers, and that resulted in 104 families receiving additional support in terms of food vouchers, essential items, and support towards gas and electricity bills. And in addition, we've worked with a new organisation called the Getaway Foundation, who have supported 10 families who will be having a holiday this year, and many for the first time. So we have been kind of brokering that and supporting those families to access that. So they're able to take a break away from the island, and they're in various holiday parks, I believe, over the summer period. So 305 young carers have engaged with the project just even in the last quarter, and they're using social media such as Facebook. They run art clubs, they've continued their one-to-one support, and delivered some face-to-face activities as well. Just one thing to note, we used to tender the YMCA, used to commission the YMCA specifically to deliver this programme. We had an opportunity to incorporate the funding for the young carers work into our family hubs and our early help commissioning process, and that's about bringing together the support that our family centres can offer to young carers as well. So that contract was awarded to Bernardo's, but as it was part of a partnership bid, and the YMCA are going to continue to deliver the young carers element, but actually it's going to be much more integrated into the rest of the work that the family hubs are delivering across the island. So that's just really an overview of the programme that's being delivered. The commissioning is for 5 years, so that funding is in place for the next 5 years. And any questions, I'm happy to respond to.
Thank you, Cathy. Any questions at all? You've done a good job there, Cathy. I've got just a couple there. It says that the strategy is due for review. Is that correct?
Yes, so there is a council strategy for carers, and as part of that there's an element specifically around young carers, and so we'll be working with our colleagues in adult social care to make sure that the views of young carers and their families are reflected in that, and that we're providing a comprehensive service to support them. So yeah, that is in motion.
It's ongoing now, okay. And what's the time frame?
I believe it's over the next 6 months. That will be, so there's a consultation exercise as part of that, but I can confirm.
And is it relevant for it to come to the committee before it's finally adopted?
I think it would be useful for this committee to see it. It does predominantly look at adults and carers in terms of adult social care, but I think it would be relevant for it to come here for an overview as well, because I think it's important that we hear what the consultation said and then how we're responding to that.
Thank you very much. So any further questions at all? Thank you, Cathy. So on to 7, annual fostering report.
You're going to take this, Debbie? Yeah. So we've been talking about fostering tonight, haven't we? So and Debbie's going to walk us through this paper about, and this I should say to new members, this is every year we receive an update on the fostering service and ditto the adoption service. So that's scheduled for tonight. So over to you, Debbie.
Okay, I hope you can hear me. Is that working? Is that better? Okay, so I'm presenting a report alongside my colleague Bernie Farmer. My name's Debbie Price and I'm the Children in Care Service Manager, which covers fostering, adoption, Bewley House, children in care and care leavers. So I'm here today to present the fostering report. So if I take you through the background, fostering services work within fostering regulations and legislation. Foster carers can be approved by independent fostering agencies or the local authority. So where the local authority doesn't have sufficient placements itself, we can look outside of that to independent fostering agencies. Now that is an important part of the job that we do, but there is a benefit to having enough sufficient in-house foster carers so that that's not necessary. And obviously that's what we're all striving towards on the island. So local authority fostering services are inspected by Ofsted as part of the overall inspection of children's services. And this year, well, last year, during 2020 to 21, the service successfully recruited and approved 9 new general fostering households and incidentally 25 connected carer households. And at the end of March 2021, there were 114 registered and approved foster care households on the Isle of Wight. There is a target next year, this year, to recruit 10 fostering households. So if I take you through the report, I'll just read out some of the highlights. So marketing has continued wherever possible. Obviously, there's had to be a big change to the way that we market. Ordinarily, we would have had lots of events, we'd have gone along to events. That had to change. So we've worked towards radio scripts and billboard adverts and really thinking about the COVID message and responding to what was going on last year to make sure that our messages resonated with people in the community. We found that word of mouth referrals peaked during the final quarter, which suggests that individuals are making lifestyle choices under the influence of their peer service, engaged with national campaigns as we usually would on social media, which included the Clap for Carers and Fostering Fortnight. And on the island, we very much made the link with our foster carers being key workers, and you may have seen the billboard that was up in Newport. So the fostering team unfortunately restructured on the 1st of April 2020. I say unfortunately because it was really bad timing just after COVID had hit. But they managed that incredibly well, and we continued to perform throughout last year despite being in a very different situation. So we restructured in terms of we restructured the permanence team into 3 hubs to look at adoption, fostering recruitment and fostering support, so that each part of the team would focus on particular areas to improve efficiency. The recruitment and assessment hub included a marketing officer to make sure that we really kept the strength in recruitment. The support hub focused on supporting foster carers, and the recruitment hub did the assessments for foster carers. So recruitment stats were lower than the previous year, but what we're finding is that some of the people that came forward last year who were really strong are beginning to come back again, because it was such a variable year. They didn't feel ready to commit to fostering, but we've kept in touch with those people and they're coming back now, which is really positive. Obviously, community events were cancelled. There were few opportunities to meet people in person. And previously, that's been one of the strongest leads into inquiries. So considering the year we had many more households approved than we had the previous year. And the approval, despite the fall in inquiries, their approval number equalled, so the conversion rate was higher. So we were more efficient last year than we had been previously. The Fostering Support Hub continued to provide support and supervision to all approved foster carers. And on the 16th of March, all groups were suspended, which is a way that we often support our foster carers, but we took those all virtually, and we took them virtually really quickly. And actually, fostering was the first part of the organisation in the council that did training virtually to foster carers. That was really positive. We do a fostering survey every year, and you can, if you look at the report, you can see it goes through a number of areas. About a third of our foster carers responded, which is about the same as the numbers that usually respond. Very positively, none of the respondents felt that they had taken a child into placement that they didn't feel equipped to care for. And when they were asked how fostering has impacted on their family, one respondent stated, "It's brought us more together and we work as a team." So we got some really good messages from our foster carers who told us they felt really well supported through a very difficult year. And careful matching was also maintained throughout the lockdown. We spent a lot of time and effort making sure that we understood when children's placements were becoming more difficult, and that we quickly put support into those placements to prevent them breaking down. We also made sure that we worked very carefully to match those children to appropriate foster carers as they were coming into care, so that we made sure that placement stability was really maintained, and that's actually improved over this year. So what our foster carers told us was they want to be more involved in supporting recruitment and the service with different activities, that they have support and training to maximise the use of IT to engage with learning in the virtual world, and we're beginning to use some volunteers to help with that. That foster carers want to see improvements in allowances. They want to return to face-to-face training and social events, and they want us to continue to focus on compliance and quality of reporting by the social workers. So in terms of the statistics, there has been an increase in households over the last year from 90 households in March 2020 to 114 in 2021. I'm not going to take you through all of these statistics. If we move towards the end, in conclusion, what we found from all of the statistics that we've looked at is that the team have continued to work well and have been able to demonstrate a greater level of compliance across all areas of work, with exception, as you might expect, of unannounced visits, which were really difficult to achieve during a pandemic. But I think, given that the team restructured in this year, the fact that they have managed to increase fostering households, increase stability and compliance is really good news for our fostering team on the island, and obviously helps us to build our reputation out there so that more foster carers want to come to us as an opportunity. Proactive support has been offered to carers through placement meetings, which we hold 3 times a week to ensure better matching, and assessment timeliness has improved within the new focused hub. I don't know if you've got any questions.
Thank you for an excellent summary. Any questions? And just a clarification, this might be me being a bit dim, is the conversion rate, how is that calculated? Is that, because that would imply 3.1% would imply there was 300 inquiries.
So it looks at the number of people that make the first contact and then the number of carers that we approve at the end of that process.
So where it says number of inquiries 65, it's actually a bigger number than that. Next it goes to number of approvals 9. So 9 of 65 is at least 14%. So you might be doing a lot better than you think. It's only a small point. I was worried I was misunderstanding.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just about to say that actually, those inquiries can span over the 2 years, because it takes 6 months to approve a foster carer. So from first inquiry to actual approval, which is where our calculation comes from, does span that bit. So you will always have that bit of an anomaly, if you like.
It was me being dim then. Thank you for that. It says about review of allowances, and I'm sure every foster carer says that. What's the time frame for the review of allowances? And
it's a tricky one. I mean, it's a bit like pay for social workers. We always have to review it on a regular basis. The allowances for foster carers is part of the Modernising Placements programme. One of the things I've wanted to do is to make sure that foster carers in Hampshire and on the Isle of Wight, that we are looking at allowances in the same way, and perhaps looking at them differently if we can as well. So that's work in progress. I think it would be unfair to say when that will end, but I reasonably within the next 12 months seems a sensible sort of window, I would suggest.
And is it appropriate again for it to come to us before, just for us to view it?
Absolutely, yep. An update on the Modernising Placement programme, what the implications are for foster carers, how we're going to support them. Very keen for that to come here in due course.
Thank you. And then the last one really is if you need any help. Point 11.12, face-to-face health assessments. I see there's a backlog, obviously because of COVID. The Health and Scrutiny Committee have been made aware of just general concerns by patients not being able to get into GPs. If it is a problem for your service, the chair of the Health and Scrutiny Committee is happy to take that forward to try and resolve it.
Okay, that's very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else, anybody? No, smashing. Move on to 8, the adoption report.
Just introducing, Chair, and this adoption's changed over the last sort of 4 or 5 years in that we had a Hampshire and Isle of Wight adoption service in the same way that we've got fostering, but a DFE initiative required us actually to have sub-regional groupings of adoption services. So we're now in partnership, so it's Hampshire and Isle of Wight, obviously, but we're now in partnership with Portsmouth and Southampton. I think it would be fair to say that the former head of the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Adoption Service is now the head of Adopt South, which covers them all. So Rachel is here, and she's very, very familiar with the island because she was previously our head of service here. So there's a lot of continuity in that. But it does, I just wanted to make the point, it's a slightly broader grouping these days. Over to you, Rachel.
Thank you. Good evening, councillors and chair. So I'm Rachel and I'm the head of Adopt South. We launched in April 2019, so we've just been going now just over 2 years. And the government asked us, local authorities, to join together to be regions, really for 3 main reasons. One was to increase their pool of adopters and to stop the delay in children being adopted. And the second one was to join together for adoption support so that across regions the offer could be the same. And I'm going to hand over to Mel shortly, who's my our Adopt South adoption support manager, who will tell you a little bit more about that. And the third reason was to actually make efficiencies and to really look at making some economies of scale there. And I'm really pleased to be able to report 2 years later that absolutely has happened. On the adopter front, the 4 local authorities the year before Adopt South approved 92 adoptive families. And in our first year, we approved 121, and our second year, 117, despite COVID. So we're very pleased about that. We've got a very passionate recruitment team, and I know Steve referred to that just now, who really believe in customer service and making sure we really reach out to people that might be interested in adoption and making sure they come to Adopt South. And that really has worked, and we've been really, really delighted with that. And we've certainly seen improvements on adoption support as well, and across the 4 local authorities. And of course, particularly for the island, who is being such a small local authority, would have always been a bit more difficult and challenged by what you can offer. And we'll certainly tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. And the third one is about efficiencies. And certainly we've seen that. So I guess to give an example, the 4 local authorities pre-Adopt South actually purchased placements for 37 children. And that would be a cost at 30,000, on average 30,000 per placement. So that's been a huge saving. In Adopt South's first year, we bought just 3 placements, and our second year 4. And we placed in our first year 118 children and 108 in our second year. So very small percentage. I think it works out 3.7%. And I guess just to give you an idea, there are 31 local REAs now. So everyone is now in an REA or about to be in an REA. I think Cornwall has been the last, and they're about to join. And on average, those 31 REAs have placed 30% of their children in external placements, and we've averaged 3.7. So I guess that just gives a bit of an idea. If we had been the national average, that would have meant we would have placed 30 children at probably a cost of about £1 million. So that gives an idea, I guess, about the saving that we've been able to make because of that. If I could just talk you through some highlights, if that's okay, and I'm just referring to the first sheet in your pack, which in my pack's purple, but it's probably black in yours. Since we've started in our 2 years, we found families for 298 children. Now, 106 of those are what we refer to as hard to place, and those are very likely to be the children that local authorities before regional adoption agencies would have gone out externally to try and find placements for those children. And that means slightly older children. Now I'm talking about 4 or 5, so I'm not talking particularly old, but in adoption terms. Sibling groups, children from Black and ethnic minority groups, and children with additional needs. And so that's really good news that we've managed to find in-house families. And of course, that's meant we could support those families locally as well. Now, 226 of those children have been formally linked, and 19 of those are the island's children. And I know that there are 2 particular children that we've probably got in mind that when Adopt South launched, we couldn't find families for on the island, and they've been waiting a long time. I think a couple of them have been waiting about 2 years, I think, Bernie, haven't they? And it's really good news that we've found placements for them, and they're now adopted. So they've been placed and adopted, which is excellent news. We've approved 238 families altogether. And I guess the good news about that is, out of all the 31 REAs, we've approved the most. And we've actually placed them, well, one of 4 local authorities who have placed over 100 children, and we've had the lowest children waiting. Just moving slightly on to adoption support, we've had 4,000 inquiries, or just short of, about 100 short of 4,000 inquiries to the adoption support line in our 2 years. Now, 650 of those were in our first year and over 3,000 in our second year, so huge difference. Partly COVID, of course, you know, adoptive families have really needed that extra support, and so we've been pleased that we've been able to be there. But I think also we've managed to establish ourselves now as that regional adoption agency that people know we're there and they can pick up the phone and actually ask for that support. We've also reduced our timescales for assessments, for when people come forward. The government give us 2 months to do what we call stage 1, which is when we gather checks and references on prospective adopters, and 4 months on stage 2, which is the face-to-face meetings that we have. And 4 months for stage 2. And again, we're really pleased that we're the only local authority that have managed to do that within timescales. I will say the Isle of Wight were very good at that beforehand, but we've reduced it, which is good news. We've also, the government also measure what we call the scorecards, which is from when children come into care and when they're placed with their adoptive family. And we're given 426 days for that. And again, or 4 local authorities actually, for those 2 years have been under the government timescale, and we're just one of 8 REAs that have achieved that. Again, I will say the local authority, the timescales, scorecards for the Isle of Wight were very good before, but they've been reduced in our second year. So that's particularly good news, that children are of course finding their forever families, their permanent families much quicker, but also, of course, the savings to local authorities when we manage to find those families and we can get them out of the care system, of course, can make a real difference as well. We've got also a very low post-adoption disruption rate. So after children are adopted, sometimes people come back, of course, many years later, and sometimes things go wrong. And I think this is credit to our support that our adoption disruption rate is much lower than the national average. We've got last year we had our own disruption rate of 0.6%, and nationally it was 3.2%, wasn't it, Mel? So a real difference. And again, we worked out that if that would have meant, if we were the national average, 30 children would have come back into care, and that's very likely to be high cost placements in foster care or residential, which would have been a cost at £2 or £3 million. And finally, for the highlight bit here, last year, 554 children and young people accessed support, which so really gives an idea, I hope, about how many children have actually come our way. So I guess highlights really is about the speed of how much quicker adopters are being approved, which has made a real difference. Choice that adopters, so children's social workers now have a real choice about what family they can choose for their child and what's the right match for them. And I guess just to give an idea, when we launched in 2019, we had just 24 adoptive families across the region who didn't have a link. And at the moment, we've got around 60. So some of those are pre-linked, or we might have children in mind, but it's certainly made a difference. And certainly from the island, that's made a huge difference, hasn't it? And I guess just to go back to the interagency, I know the island actually bought or purchased 7 external placements the year before we launched. And so that obviously has been very different this time. And sometimes, what Stuart was saying was absolutely right. It's right to place children off the island, but it's equally right sometimes to place them within their own community. And we've approved 8 adopters actually who live on the island in the last 2 years, and we've got another 4 in assessment. So in the next couple of months, we will have approved 12 of adopters who actually live here. So for the island, I think there's been some real advantages. I think particularly those 2 children without a pre-link and now finding their permanent families has been a real credit to everyone, not only Adopt South, but to the Isle of Wight Local Authority, who we've worked so closely with to find those right families. And of course that saving as well, so that we don't have to go out and buy not only the funding side, but the fact, of course, then you're placing children miles from home and you're trying to support that adoptive family, and obviously real challenges there about how we do that, and we can be confident about our own adoption support and what we can offer. I'm just going to hand over to Mel just to tell you a little bit more about adoption support, if that's okay.
Hi there. Hello. Just to tell you a little bit about the economies of scale that have come with us joining together as a regional adoption agency. We're now in a position where, for the smaller unitary authorities, we can present bigger, a larger offer. We can offer therapeutic parenting programs that actually potentially we weren't able to offer there when they were only for 1 or 2 people. We made good use of the COVID-19 scheme. The Department for Education made some money available specifically for adopted children who were experiencing, when the families were experiencing difficulties in the COVID pandemic. We made good use of that. There were families who were able to get immediate support from specialist therapists to help them manage some of the challenges that came with the pandemic. We are talking about a group of children who are already vulnerable. They are previously looked after children, so their needs were absolutely exacerbated as much as any other children in terms of in the pandemic. We are offering many more virtual services, so whereas previously our support groups were in person, we may go back to some of that, but we've actually been able to offer a wide range of services virtually, which has made it much more accessible for our families on the Isle of Wight. We do copy and chat evenings, which we deliver with a mentor, so that the people can really get together and talk about some of the issues that they're facing. We are actually about to have, on the 30th of June, we're having a consultation, because although we've learned loads of lessons in COVID about how we can do things virtually, it's really important for us to go back to the things that work best face to face. And the way we'll know about what's needed on the island is to meet with our adopters specifically who are living on the island to talk about. We run activities for young people who are adopted to get together and talk about that experience and what that means for them. Some of that can be done virtually, but I really want to learn from our adopters on the island what will benefit them most to come back to face, and what will benefit them most and be more accessible if we continue to deliver it virtually. So that's a bit of we offer workshops. We've got lots of workshops we deliver about how to deal with social media, how to parent teens, those kind of things that really have a specific adoption related slant to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel and Mel. Any questions? No, I think you've done a good job there. I haven't got it either, really. It was, well, one really, but you probably answered it, is you mentioned that changing of staff, and you allow for that, is just how would the impact on children and families taken into account when you are making staff changes?
Sorry, Chair, I didn't hear that.
Sorry, you mentioned in the Adopt South report that post-adoption support families were held by the assistant team manager until the post was filled, and it was a good practice, create collaborative working by the white social workers and their colleagues in Adopt South. It was just, how did you assess the change of staff and the impact it may have on children and families, or was it might not be relevant?
Well, I think while we were recruiting to the post on the islands, we did have the assistant team manager hold those cases. We have a allocated member of staff. We do have a full-time member of staff on the islands now just for adoption support. However, I do think there would be some real benefits about actually having an off-island member of staff as well, hold a small cluster of cases to almost build up a little bit of capacity for give if somebody's circumstances change and aren't available, but actually has that almost that focus and that presence on the island as well, just to build a bit more give and capacity to that system. It hasn't been a problem. We do have to allocate across the region already. The benefits of our adoption support in the region is that in many areas you have to wait up to 3 to 6 months for an assessment of your adoption support needs. We run to 5 days to get an allocation of a social worker to do that assessment, and in over 80 to 85% of our circumstances, those assessments are concluded within 45 days. That's a self-imposed timescale. It matches children and families assessments. We're not required to do it, but we do believe that if families need a response and they need support, then they need it in a timely manner.
Thank you.
Oh, there we go. That's a really important thing, actually, because, of course, if families need support and then they can't access it from adoption support, like, as you've outlined, Mel, they end up coming in through the front door of children's social care, because then at risk of breakdown. So getting that adoption support in quickly is really, really important, and it's been a really good bit of the service as we've gone forward.
No, thank you. That's really encouraging. It's really nice to read the report. Some fantastic stuff. You're very pleased, I think, with what you've achieved so far. Any further questions? No, thank you. So that takes us on to, I believe, our work plan. Am I right, Paul? Correct me if I'm wrong. Committee's work plan. So we'll meet informally to discuss the work plan properly, so I won't bore you all with that. But just to be aware, the Corporate Scrutiny Committee has requested that we look at the 2 recent Ombudsman cases when dealing with the annual complaints report at the next meeting, and also we're aware of the concerns expressed about pupil numbers at Cowes Enterprise College. I'm sure that's no surprise to any of you. We'd like to see a report being submitted to it regarding the processes behind planning school places across the island. So just a couple of points there.
Was that across the island? Yeah, okay, that's fine. In the September one?
It basically just for clarity, so that because it's going to come up again, and I know it's going to be a very emotive subject for families again.
Yep, no problem.
The last bit, if there's any members' questions outside of anything we've not covered. John, or Councillor Medland, sorry.
This is not a question, it's a thank you very much for the presentations this evening. It's been really very impressive, and I thank you for your journeys over here and giving us such a lot of detail. It's been very useful.
Yeah, I'll definitely second that. Thank you. It's much appreciated giving up your time, and it looks like we've actually beat the 2 hours as well. So you'll be on an earlier jet or an extra cup of tea or pint or whatever it is. So yeah, thank you all. Thank you, members, as well. I'll conclude the meeting there, I think, Paul.